Tinos, you're somewhere in the same place, aren't you?
Oh, okay.
We're meeting in 3D in an hour or so. Yeah, he's part of the same panel meeting.
Okay. So Christoph is joining as well. Meanwhile, I'll be introducing Tobia, and so that we can start and we can finish in time. So, hello everyone, and welcome. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Tobia Spampatti. Tobia is a PhD candidate in neuroscience at the CDSB, Consumer Decision and Sustainable Behavior Lab at the University of Geneva. And I believe he's soon to become a doctor, like he has to defend on Monday. So, good luck with that. His research primarily focuses on the cognitive, social, and affective psychological factors that influence how people process information and misinformation, and how this subsequently shapes emotions and decisions. His research has been featured in national and international news outlets, and is also an advocate of open science practices, so much that he won the Swiss Reproducibility Award in 2022. Today is going to present a comprehensive theoretical framework published in Nature Human Behavior for understanding the factors influencing the acceptance or rejection of scientific evidence about climate change, together with the evaluation of 6 inoculation strategies in combating its relative disinformation. So thank you very much, Tobia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind words of introduction and for, well, having me here in the first place. I will try to share my screen. Do the technological overlords, are they working fine? Okay, great. So, so yeah, I am happy to present to you basically not only the NHB paper that that you might have received via email, but also a couple of more works that have expanded on this particular paper that I hope will be your interest. But the title of my presentation is Ecological Inoculations Not to Fight Climate Disinformation Across 12 Countries. So as a starting point, it's always useful to remind everybody here as scientists that, well, we kind of have a scientific consensus regarding what it means to be in a climate crisis, because 99% of experts on climate, or experts that are climate scientists, agree that there is anthropogenic global warming, and also the IPCC kind of continues along those paths, saying that it's unequivocal. The human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. However, I think as social scientists, we can also agree that the situation in the public discourse is a little bit more complicated, because public discourse is polluted, pun intended, by different types, almost 60 different types of climate disinformation that can question the science and the actions that should be taken to mitigate or adapt to climate change. Now, there are, as I said, many different types. There also been this recent paper that I really like on discourses of climate delay that try to kind of delay the climate mitigation action that we're supposed to be taking as a global society. So much so that the first draft of the latest IPCC report highlighted how misinformation and politicization of climate science by vested interest has been the main barrier for adaptation. Now, one tidbit that I always like to remind my audience is that this specific mention or this specific graphic of barriers and misinformation has been removed by subsequent version of the IPCC by the same vested interests that are mentioned in this graph. So this type of influence is really important at the societal level. But as psychologists here, I think we're all interested as to why misinformation may work, or disinformation may work at a psychological level. Now, I was very happy that kind of this work on understanding the psychological basis of climate disinformation was already done by somebody else, including people here in this room. The first work that kind of influenced the work that I'm going to be presenting you is this PNAS paper by Philip Miller and colleagues, where they look at the core communicational basis of anti-scientific belief. And basically what they identified is, well, the basics of communication, which is the sources of an anti-scientific message, the scientific message or the anti-scientific message itself, and the receiver of a scientific message or anti-scientific message. They also identify the internal state, but for the sake of this presentation, I consider the internal state of the receiver and the receiver itself as kind of the same category. At the same time, another review paper came out kind of at the same time that identified what are called the psychological drivers of misinformation belief and its resistance to collection. And in that case, authors have identified basically two pathways to which psychological drivers may influence false or true belief formation and updating, which are the, cognitive pathway, where they identify different drivers, and also the socioaffective pathway, where they identified other different drivers that are more socioaffective in nature. So just to give you an example of what these drivers may look like, I think you might be familiar or not with this US senator who brought a snowball to Congress to basically say, well, if I can have this snowball here, climate change isn't real. And by psychologically speaking, we can think that, well, they try to appeal on the intuitive, an intuitive type of reasoning that people might be more or less predisposed to in order to convince the audience that climate change isn't real. Now, what we understood, or when I read these two papers together, I realized, well, they kind of seem to be complementing each other pretty well. So what we decided to do was to kind of merge the two frameworks together to identify both the core communicational basis and the psychological drivers in what we call a comprehensive framework of anti-science belief updating, where we can literally map where anti-science messages or anti-scientific beliefs might enter somebody's psyche. And after having done this, we realized, okay, per each one of the drivers, we can try to create interventions that can protect people at the level of each driver against misinformation. So what we did is that we created 6 different psychological inoculations. I am not going to obviously explain to you what psychological inoculations are. I'm sure you're familiar with. But we created 6 different types of inoculation that operate at each one of the drivers to protect people from misinformation. And just to give you an example of these, the cognitive pathway driver that acts on the source of the scientific message is basically considering scientific sources, and we try to intervene on this driver by basically adapting the Sander van der Linden's inoculation on scientific consensus inoculation. And at the same time, for the socioaffective pathway, for the same core communicational basis, we use we adapted the trust inoculation, which we developed in our lab, to trust in the IPCC scientists that they know what they're talking about when it comes to climate change, to try to protect people against misinformation. And just to go back to the example that I've given you before, when it comes to intuitive versus deliberative reasoning, we adapted the accuracy nudge by Pennycook and Rand into an accuracy inoculation that will move participants into thinking more deliberatively about the misinformation that they will receive in our study. Spoiler alert. So what we did is that we conducted our pre-registered report, well, a registered report, whereby we basically sampled almost 7,000 participants from the 12 countries that you see over here. And we have chosen the 12 countries because English was a main language. So we didn't have to translate the materials according to language, but we maintain English throughout the full 12 countries, where we divided participants into 8 conditions. 6 of which receive an inoculation and then 20 consecutive climate disinformation statements that I'm going to show you very soon, and a passive control condition that only received the disinformation statements. We also added, thanks to the reviewers, a pure control condition that neither received the inoculation nor the disinformation, so we could also measure the effects of receiving multiple disinformation, its effects on different outcomes that are of relevance, such as climate change belief, climate-friendly behavior that was measured with the Working for an Environmental Protection task, and a truth discernment task where people had to, basically discern between true and false information regarding climate change that I'm going to show you very soon. Just to show you a bit of how the inoculations looked, the distrust in science inoculation and all inoculations started with the same moderately threatening information first. where we basically took it from Sander van der Linden and colleagues, inoculation, that basically says, well, we do have a consensus. However, there are some politically motivated people that use misleading tactics to try to convince the public that there is disagreement among scientists. And what we did after is that we varied the inoculation component, or the vaccine shot component, according to each one of the inoculations. And here, for the trust inoculation, you see different cues as to why the IPCC scientists are trustworthy when it comes to climate change. And here, just to show you the moralization inoculation, we had a slightly different text where we added as many moral words from the Moral Foundation Dictionary possible to basically cue the moralization of climate action. And basically, these are just 2 examples, but we had 6 inoculations, as I said before. For the disinformation statements, we took a step back, and basically what I did is that I coded from available sources all the different well-known disinformers that are out there in the world, sadly. And I basically coded whether or not they had an active Twitter account or not. And through the Twitter API, I basically harvested all their tweets from account creation until I think it was COP28. And out of these, I manually coded a random selection of 20,000 of them according to the classification by Cohen and colleagues of climate misinformation and discourses of delay to create what we call a climate disinformation corpus that has 78 of these statements that we then try to validate following the guidelines by Gordon Pennycook and David Rand along 15 different validation measures with a representative sample of British participants. So basically, we try to validate a set of ecologically valid disinformation statements that were actually used in the real world to disinform about climate science and climate mitigation action. Out of this, we created what we call a climate disinformation corpus, which is already available as a preprint in case you're interested, in case you want to do research with this type of information. And from this, we took the 20 statements that were most representative of all the data set. So we try to have a variety of statements, but also as representatives as we could of the climate disinformation that people can find online or on Twitter, at least. And basically what happened is that participants received a screenshot that looked like a tweet that they may find, after which we asked consecutively after each one of the statements, what kind of feelings do you have about actions to mitigate climate change? Do you feel negatively or do you feel positively? And we use this measure basically because we know from past research that how people feel about a specific policy, for example, predicts whether or not they will support it, whether or not they will vote favor in it, whether they consider it risky or beneficial, etc. So we thought this was a psychological construct that basically predates all subsequent research in one. This was another example of a statement that we had, and basically participants were bombarded, or at least in 7 conditions, they were bombarded by 20 different statements like this. After this, we measure, as I said, pro-environmental behavior with a web task, whereby participants had to decide basically whether or not they wanted to do identification task. I think you can see that there are small numbers there. They were supposed to identify specific numbers in this table, and per each page they would complete, we would plant 1 tree. So basically, it was an effort task whereby the more pages the participants complete, the more pro-environmental they are, because we will be planting more trees. And after each page, participants could decide, I want to continue with these tasks, or not. And basically, we could count how many pages they completed from 0 to 8 pages, and that was our measure of pro-environmental behavior. When it comes to the truth discernment task, we follow Rocco and Meriton's paper on creating a truth discernment task for misinformation. And what we did, we used ChatGPT to create 20 different, 300 statements, out of which we chose 20 different statements that were either true statements or false statements about climate action, and either supporting or being in favor of climate action or trying to delay climate action. So we had a 2x2 grid with true and false and supporting versus delaying climate change. And these are all the I mean, they are all available in the paper, but these are all the statements in case you're interested. I will come back to this because we had a deeper look at the control condition and the disinformation condition on this data that I think will be very interesting. So one thing that I didn't mention when it comes to the measures that we also had a manipulation check that looked at whether or not the inoculations would increase resistance to persuasion. Because we know from the literature, one of the main ways that inoculations work is that they increase resistance to follow-up persuasion, or they increase resistance to items like I will resist the conspiracy theories about climate change. So before we gave the 20 disinformation statements, we measure resistance to persuasion. And basically what we find is that all inoculation, but the scientific consensus inoculation, increase self-reported resistance to persuasion. So in a sense, we know that the inoculations are doing what they're supposed to be doing. What happens when it comes to receiving the 20 different information statements? Well, what happens is that, unfortunately, we couldn't really find a main effect of our inoculations. As you can see, the separation between the lines in gray of the control condition that received the 20 disinformation statements and the color one, which are the inoculations, there is not that much of a separation. And when you look at the final point, so after the 20 different information statements, there was no significant difference across the inoculations, and all the equivalence tests were also significant. So we couldn't say that there was a significant difference between the conditions, but we could say that if there was a difference, it was statistically significantly smaller than a coin-D of 0.20. What happens when it comes to belief in climate change, belief in the reality of climate change, in the anthropogenic nature of climate change, in the negative consequences of climate change, in their truth discernment score? So how many true and false information they categorize correctly, and this pro-environmental behavior, so how many trees they plant. Well, first of all, we see that the disinformation condition decreases basically everything compared to the pure control condition. So disinformation decreases belief in the reality of climate change, belief in the anthropogenic nature of climate change. Well, in the paper we didn't really interpret the p-value of the belief in the climate change consequences, but we see that also it decreases the truth discernment score, and importantly, it decreases pro-environmental behavior. And when it comes to the inoculation in and of themselves, we see that there is unfortunately not really any effect of the inoculations, but for the accuracy inoculation that you can see down here at the bottom, that kind of protected people discernment from true and false information. But otherwise, all the equivalence tests were again significant. So we know that there was no significant difference between receiving only the disinformation and receiving the disinformation plus the inoculations. And if there was an effect, it was significantly smaller than a coin-D of 0.20. Now, one thing that we also pre-registered is that, okay, we have these inoculations that are supposedly acting on these two different pathways, the cognitive pathway and the socioaffective pathway. So maybe we shouldn't be looking at a main effect, but we should be looking at a moderation by whether or not people are more disposed to act on one of the pathways compared to the other. So we thought there would be a moderation of the effectiveness of the inoculation by whether or not the inoculation matched participants' disposition to use one of the pathways, one pathway over the other. And this we measured with the cognitive reflection task. They basically looked at whether people are disposed to reason more in an intuitive way or in a deliberative way. And basically, we tried to see whether the cognitive inoculations worked better for participants who are more deliberative thinkers, and the socioaffective inoculations for people who were more intuitive thinkers. And this is actually what we found. So here, what you can see in blue is kind of people who are more deliberative, and in red, people who are more intuitive. And what you can see is that there is this difference whereby inoculations that act on the cognitive pathway, which are on the left, they protect participants more than inoculations that are on the social affective pathway, and the other way around for people who are intuitive. So basically what we see is that the effectiveness of inoculation is significantly moderated by the cognitive reflection, so much so that cognitive inoculations should be, or participants who are deliberative should be targeted by cognitive-based inoculations, and participants who are more intuitive would be benefiting more by inoculations that are more socio-affective in nature. Now, another moderation that we looked at more in an exploratory matter is political ideology. Obviously, you're all familiar with the effect of being more conservative oriented versus liberal oriented when it comes to climate change, when it comes to susceptibility to misinformation. So we looked at whether or not the inoculation would be moderated by that. And it actually does not seem to be the case. So this is just the effect of the trust of the moderation on the trust in scientists inoculation. But in general, we didn't find any effect across the 12 countries altogether for a moderation by political ideology. So there was no moderation there on the effectiveness of the inoculation. So just to conclude this part, the conclusions of this paper were that basically, well, climate disinformation affects basically every DV that we measured. I know there are discussions right now as to whether or not disinformation is a problem or disinformation affects people. Well, actually, the evidence that we have seems to suggest that at least climate disinformation does. And in comparisons, the inoculations that we thought would be protecting people had no effect, except for the accuracy inoculation on truth discernment, or that their effect, if present, was much smaller than a coin Z of 0.20, which I forgot to say is basically the meta-analytically identified effect size of fact-checking. So they do not really provide more protection than what fact-checking does. And one positive thing to highlight is that this tendency for intuitive versus deliberative thinking, or this tendency to prefer one type of pathway over the other seems to moderate the effectiveness of the inoculation. So it might be worth micro-targeting the inoculations to the people who will benefit from it the most. And overall, we see that climate disinformation is an obvious influence in public perception of climate science and climate action, even after 50 years that we have had climate disinformation. And our conclusion was that, well, we kind of need to develop better behavioral and systemic interventions to fight climate disinformation. Now, this was the NHB paper. And what I want to talk to you about next is a bit going back to this capacity to, or this task whereby we ask participants to distinguish between true and false information and information that support or delay climate action. Because I think the evidence that we have in this data set can kind of be useful into understanding why people might be affected by this information or not. And this I find interesting because when we look at the literature regarding the psychological mechanism behind susceptibility to misinformation, we have many different theories or hypotheses out there. We have the motivated reasoning hypothesis, which I think you're all familiar with. We have the expressive responding hypothesis. We have more recently the lazy not biased hypothesis by Pernicook and Ran. And even more recently than that, the partisans in bias hypothesis of Van Bavel and colleagues, and many others. And one thing that strikes me about all these different hypotheses is that they make different predictions as to how participants should categorize true and false and ideologically congruent and ideologically incongruent information as the two main dimensions of type of information that participants can receive. So like I coded them, I coded kind of the definitions in these two type of of dimensions, because it kind of shows that, for example, the motivated reasoning hypothesis looks at whether or not information is congruent or incongruent with somebody's ideology, while instead, for example, the partisan implicit bias hypothesis says that, well, conservatives are more affected by misinformation that is also aligned with their political ideology. And one thing that I find very, very interesting with this task is that when we try to look, when we have a task like this, when you can dissect whether or not information are true and false, and whether information are ideologically congruent or ideologically incongruent, and in this case, information that tries to delay climate action would be ideologically congruent with a conservative ideology, and information that is in support of climate action would be incongruent with a conservative ideology, we can kind of make different predictions as to how these the different hypotheses would look for the performance of this task. For example, the motivated reasoning hypothesis would kind of predict that the more conservative participants are, the less likely they are to say that information in support of climate action is true, regardless of whether this information is true or not. But because it is ideologically congruent to a conservative ideology, people are less likely, or conservatives are less likely to believe that to be true. And the other way around for well, statements that try to delay climate action. When it comes to expressive responding, instead, you might expect participants who are more conservative to be less likely to report that true information that support climate action are true, because they see it less in their overall environment. And the other way around for disinformation that tries to delay climate action, because that type of information we have seen from past research is the one that is most present in their information environment. So basically, what we can do is that we have these different predictions of how these different hypotheses, different predictions of the performance in this task made by the different hypotheses, and then I can look at the results and match it back to the predictions that we have regarding the performance. And I did that with the control condition and with the disinformation condition. So for the control condition is basically a correlational analysis that will look at how political ideology affects people's ability to discriminate between true and false information and ideologically congruent and ideologically incongruent information. And basically, what do we see for the support is that there is no relationship between a conservative ideology and basically discriminating between true and false information that are in support of climate change. For the delay, instead, there is a small but significant relationship whereby conservatives are more likely to report that this information that says we shouldn't act to mitigate climate change is true. And I find this super interesting because on the one hand, it kind of looks like an expressive responding, or it kind of looks like evidence that is in support of expressive responding, because it is the type of disinformation that are more present in conservative environment, but also partisanship bias hypothesis, because conservatives are more likely to believe misinformation that are ideologically congruent. And another thing that is interesting is that kind of disinformation that tries to delay climate mitigation action is the logical opposite of information that is in support of climate action. Because one is about basically, well, denying that carbon dioxide, for example, is a pollutant. And on the other side, there are also statements that says, well, climate change is real and it's caused by carbon emissions. So basically, what it seems to be the case is that participants, or conservative participants at least, do not reason about, well, if I believe one thing to be true, the opposite should be false. But instead, they seem to be reporting as true the type of information that is more, the type of disinformation that is more ideologically congruent. What happens for when they receive this information? So this is the graph of the participants who only received this information, but not the inoculation. And basically, what you can see is that the left part of the graph is unchanged, So participants, after receiving this information, do not believe more in this information about that tries to delay climate mitigation action. But what they do instead is there is a decrease in whether or not they believe true information in support of climate action as true. So basically, this information seems to be affecting really their perception of true information that is in support of climate mitigation action. Which again, it's very difficult with the hypothesis that we have right now to kind of consider what is going on, because, well, we haven't before, or at least I haven't seen papers that try to dissect these two components before. So what we can conclude with this paper, which is currently under review and hopefully out soon, is that, well, conservative political ideology is only related to participants believing more in false statements that try to delay climate action, and instead it's reading this information that causes them also to not believe true information in support of climate action. And out of the different hypotheses, it seems to reflect a combination of responsive responding and partisanship bias. And overall, what it seems to be the case to us is that the relationship between climate skepticism, or people's ability to discern between true and false information about climate change and political ideology, is a little bit more complicated than the hypothesis that we have right now. And I think it's really important that we understand this mechanism better to fight climate disinformation, because, for example, at the baseline, both liberals and conservatives were very, very good at discriminating whether true information about climate change are true or not. So interventions that try to increase their belief in true information might not be the best because they are already maxed out somehow. So maybe in interventions that try to remove as much climate disinformation from a conservative social media diet, or information diet in general, might be better suited to fight climate disinformation than information that tries to only bolster the truth. Or at least that's our opinion, and I'm very happy to discuss. Now, the final point that I would like to make in this presentation, and I'm realizing that I'm speaking for once faster than normal, so I hope we will have more time for discussion, is that when it comes to truth discernment, this truth discernment task made me wonder when it comes to evaluating misinformation interventions. This is a question that is open to every one of you. I wonder, what is the objective of misinformation intervention? And for me, the response is try to create as much societal benefit of our intervention as possible. And now this type of objective can be measured in many, many different ways. And there has been in recent years a push towards measuring truth discernment, or this ability to discriminate between true and false information, as kind of the main outcome of a misinformation intervention. However, after going through this data, or after thinking about this type of about what it means to have an effective intervention, I'm not so sure, and I have a manuscript in preparation that kind of tries to argue that this might not be the best way of trying to measure the effectiveness of an intervention. And this is because of multiple reasons. But going back to this truth discernment task, I want to show you what the performance of the truth discernment task, how it is correlated with people's climate change beliefs. So what you can see here is that, well, the more participants believe in climate change, the better at discriminating between true and false information that tries to delay climate mitigation actions are. So the more participants believe in climate change, the less affected they are by this information that says, well, carbon dioxide is not a pollutant. Okay, but when it comes to true and false information that support climate action, what you can see is here that more participants believe in climate change, the more they consider also false information in support of climate action as true. And these are information that says, for example, we're going to have 20 degrees of warming by 2100, or that all coastal cities will be absolutely submerged. And this is, well, this is suboptimal for sure. But if we focus on true discrimination, looking at this graph, we might think that, well, people who believe in climate change might be the one who will benefit the most by learning to discern information, true and false information, the better. Which it is a scientifically accurate question, but maybe in terms of practicality for society, people who believe in climate change, even if they don't have a perfect true discernment, but they still act pro-environmentally, they might be less of a priority to change than participants who don't believe in climate change and do not act pro-environmentally. So I think focusing only on true discernment might make us misidentify those populations who are more vulnerable at misinformation. And the problem to me is exacerbated by the relationship between true discernment and actual behavior. Because obviously I have a measure of behavior in this study. So I've looked at the correlation between true discernment and this task whereby participants can plant more trees. And I think you don't have to have a PhD in the social sciences to appreciate the fact that these lines are very flat. You can test it with equivalence testing, but and it will tell you that the relationship between true discernment, regardless of which line you look at, and pro-environmental behavior is significantly less than a correlation of 0.10. So the relationship between actually acting pro-environmentally and being able to discriminate between true and false information is so small that you could argue that it's practically meaningless. So again, if we only focus on true discrimination, we might lose interventions that, for example, would affect pro-environmental behavior more. Because what happened in the NHB paper is that out of all the possible interventions that we had, the only one that has a significant positive effect was this accuracy inoculation on true discernment. And if we only measure true discernment, we might consider this inoculation as successful, and we might want to scale it up at the information environment. However, this type of inoculation does not seem to really affect behavior. So the question is, well, do we really want to only use true discernment as our measure to identify promising interventions, or should we do something different? And I think in this paper, what I try to argue is that instead of only looking at true discernment, as some of the recent discussion seems to be arguing for, I think we have to look at multiple behaviors, but also we have to basically, I think we have to identify whether or not there is a threshold by which you have to have enough true discernment to then move on to better outcomes. Because obviously you need to have somewhat of a good or a good enough ability in discerning between true and false information to really process information and identify which behaviors to enact. But after that point, maybe a better interventions would be to increase pro-environmental behavior in the case of the climate domain. And in the pandemic domain, it might be interventions that increase protective behavior, such as mask wearing or social distancing, etc. So the broad conclusion that I want to leave you with is that well, I think we should assess multiple psychological and societally relevant outcomes over and above just true discernment. And I think one promising way of doing that is also through other ways than experiments, such as mathematical modeling or agent-based models. Like I'm a very big fan of this paper by Joe Coleman and colleagues, whereby they look at information diffusion in a social network and its effect and the effect of interventions, psychological interventions on that. And I think we can do the same with, well, models that try to model pro-environmental behavior and to see whether or not truth discernment interventions might affect behavior. So I know there was a lot. Thank you very much for listening. One thing that happened today actually is that another paper of ours that I wanted to present to you, which is the trust inoculation, got published today in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. So if you were interested in that as well, you may find it here and actually on the paper. And I know that it might have been a bit of a depressive talk. So this is just to raise everybody's spirit up before the questions.
Thank you very much, Tobia. Yes, Steve unfortunately has to leave, and not only for the interesting talk, but also for the interesting questions that we were left with. So we have plenty of time for discussions. Let's see if we have already some questions ready from the audience. This is Steve coming up.
Or answers to my questions.
Or answers, yes.
I have a question. Did you look at the relationship within each country between conservatism and specific climate attitudes or changes?
Yeah, that's a question that I always get. Unfortunately not, because we had around 570 participants per country, which roughly translates into having 50 participants per country per condition. And that makes it very, very hard to really look at interactions in general. So I could have looked, but I didn't feel confident enough in the results to really report that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. Do you have any insight as to what could be? I mean, I'm obviously more familiar with American politics in the context of climate change, but I'm trying to think, are similar conditions occurring in the other countries you sampled as well? I mean, I really don't know I think it was India, right? Like how does climate issues, how do they map on to like political attitudes?
So in general, there is, I don't know if you're familiar with the climate many labs, but basically there is a many lab experiment in 60 countries that got published in February in Science Advances, which is called Addressing Climate Change with Behavioral Interventions, I think, or something like that. I mean, I should know. I am one of the people there, but basically they have an open data set with 60 different countries and the WEPT and climate beliefs and other variables. So that would be the place I would go to look at that. I know that the team has a paper out on the effects of political ideology on 12 different behavioral science-based interventions. And basically there, what they find is across 60 countries, all behavioral science interventions backfire for conservatives when it comes to behavior. So like there is, we have to basically, we have to have better evidence when it comes to the relationship between conservative and liberal ideology across countries. But yeah, some may say that in general, conservatives are more resistant to interventions that try to increase climate friendly action, for example, in general.
Do you think that would be, I mean, could it just be a result of conservatives being more conservative and climate action requiring action? I mean, I'm trying to think maybe if there's like an inverse situation in which the status quo is something that is more progressive, and then the conservatives would advocate to change it.
So now I'm trying to go by memory, but they in this many labs they had system justification intervention. So like to maintain the current way of life, we have to like lower our emissions, for example, and that backfired as well. So I am not particularly sure of what I think we need more evidence again on the relationship between conservatism and climate mitigation, support for climate mitigation action in general. And there was one school of thought that considered the fact that trying to protect our current way of life, trying to protect what we have right now from the long-term effects of climate change might be actually a type of literally conservative point of view. So
Mhm.
it's a bit how to say illogical to be it's illogical for conservatives to be resistant to conservation efforts somehow.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's very complicated. I mean, my 2 cents on it is that I think it's more about I mean, it's not a revolutionary thinking, but it's more about the type of information that conservatives receive more than ideology in and of itself. But that is something that I hope to test in the postdoc that I'm gonna do.
What do you mean type of information?
So like that conservatives are within information spheres where the prevalence of information that it goes against the scientific consensus regarding climate change and against supporting climate mitigation actions, that type of information is what leads them to being resistant to climate mitigation action rather than an ideologically based reasoning.
Mhm. Cool, thank you.
Assuming that I've understood your last point, is there an alternative way of looking at the issue of conservatism in the sense that if you look at people's lifestyles, then their lifestyle will need to change, and therefore, in that sense, conservation is not keeping things the same; it's having to change things.
That's a very valid point. I don't know of any interventions that has looked at it that angle, but it would be cool to test.
Yeah, I have a curiosity about a graph that I don't know if I read it well, but there was a sort of a graph showing the tasks that you created to test like people willingness to collaborate, like with trees planting or numbers, something like that. And it was like the no control group was very fun. I don't know if that's significant. Was that because their survey was simply shorter? They have more energy to go through. But why the pure control is much more right than the others?
So one thing that I looked is the correlation between time spent in the disinformation task and the performance of in this task, because I had that here as well. And actually, the more participants spend reading the disinformation, the more environmental behavior they had. So that leads me to believe that it was not a question of timing, but it's actually a question of the disinformation itself.
Okay.
I would have loved to have a control group, but an active control group, but we didn't do that.
Okay.
I actually also have a question about that task. I was wondering what made you choose, I mean, I understand why you would choose something that is more behavioral or more like actual rather than self-report. But I also feel like maybe this specific type of like actual action is pretty far away. I mean, did you have any additional assessment of like daily ecological behaviors or daily kind of behaviors that address climate change?
So short answer is no, we didn't. We wanted to really have an online task that we could deliver to participants in such a way that it would allow us to infer the effects of this information.
Mhm.
And this is basically the only task that could have fit. I mean, the only task that basically was close to a validated measure, because it is an adapted version of an actually validated task, which is called the working for environmental protection task. And so yeah, basically there was a question of availability and a question of as close as possible to validity. Now, one thing that I should have mentioned is that we planted almost 11,000 trees with this task. So at least like there was one positive outcome into making 7,000 more like climato-skeptics.
One very quick question, if I may, just to check that I heard you correctly. Did you say that you hand coded 20,000 tweets?
Well, actually 30,000, but only 20,000 in English.
Wow, that must have taken some time.
And yeah, some faith in humanity as well.
Well, if there aren't any more questions, maybe we can end this a bit earlier and let us free and maybe have a lunch or something. But thank you very much, Tobia, for this discussion, and best of luck for Monday for your discussion, like the PhD station. And I hope we stay in touch, because I can see like you integrated many of the paper that circulate around in our group, like from Steve and company. So I hope that we'll keep in touch, and I'll see you. And thank you for everyone that stayed stayed around on Zoom. So thank you very much. So I'll see you probably next, I don't know, like September or something. We'll stay in touch for that. And not sure if I'll still be organizing this. I may not be here anymore, but we'll see. But thank you very much. And bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you for having me again, and thank you for the nice questions.